It only took one wrong place and one wrong time to erase an entire lifetime, not in a dramatic explosion or a loud arrest, but quietly, almost politely, the way systems steal lives without ever raising their voice. Because on that ordinary evening, nothing about him looked dangerous, suspicious, or worthy of attention. He was just another man moving through the city with tired eyes and simple plans, thinking about dinner, about the message he still hadn't replied to, about the tomorrow that felt guaranteed the way tomorrows always do until the last normal moment slips by unnoticed. And later, you can never pinpoint exactly when life stopped being yours, only that it did suddenly, permanently, and without asking permission. He had no idea that somewhere nearby, invisible forces were already colliding, that files were being opened, timelines were being misread, assumptions being stacked on top of assumptions. And once your name enters that machinery, truth becomes optional, context becomes irrelevant, and innocence becomes an inconvenience nobody has time to verify. The street he walked down had seen 1,000 faces before him. But on that night, it became a crime scene by coincidence alone. A location that would soon matter more than his entire history, more than decades of quiet living, more than every person who could swear they knew his character. Because when power looks for answers, it often settles for the nearest body. He didn't run, he didn't hide, he didn't resist. That's what makes it crueler, because compliance is supposed to protect you. Honesty is supposed to matter, and telling the truth is supposed to clear things up, but instead, it sealed his fate, because his story didn't match theirs, and in systems built on conclusions rather than questions. A mismatch isn't a mystery, it's a threat. The first interview felt informal, almost routine. The kind of conversation where you still believe misunderstandings can be corrected with patience, where you still think facts exist independently of who controls them. But every answer he gave only tightened the room. Every explanation sounded like an excuse to ears that had already decided what they needed him to be. Somewhere between the second question and the fourth pause, the tone shifted, the warmth drained, and the invisible line was crossed. The moment where you stop being a witness and start becoming a suspect, even though no one ever tells you that out loud. They told him it would be sorted out quickly. They always do. They said his cooperation would help. They said the evidence would speak for itself. What they didn't say was that evidence can be shaped, timelines compressed, and coincidences framed until they resemble intent. And once that happens, your truth becomes noise, something to be filtered out rather than understood. Hours turned into days, days into months, and the man who had walked into the wrong place at the wrong time found himself trapped inside a narrative he didn't write and couldn't escape. Friends grew distant, not out of cruelty, but fear. Because proximity to suspicion is contagious, and belief is fragile when authority sounds confident. Phone calls became shorter. Support became conditional. Silence began to replace outrage, and that silence was louder than any accusation. In courtrooms and offices far from public view, decisions were made that would define the rest of his existence. Not based on who he was, but on what was convenient to conclude. Paperwork moved faster than people. Stamps fell heavier than testimonies, and once the system leaned forward, it didn't stop to check who it was crushing beneath its weight. He watched his name lose its meaning, watched it turn into a case number, watched strangers debate his future with professional detachment, as if a lifetime could be measured in folders and footnotes. He kept telling the truth, because what else does an innocent person have? But truth is fragile when power doesn't need it. And repetition doesn't make it louder. It only makes it easier to ignore. The sentence didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It came calmly, methodically, delivered in language designed to sound reasonable. Almost administrative, but every word carried years inside it. Years he could already feel slipping away before they were officially taken. When the doors closed behind him for the first time, the sound wasn't dramatic, just heavy final, a sound that told him the world outside would keep moving without him, birthdays would pass parents. Would age, seasons would change, and none of it would wait for the truth to catch up. Prison doesn't just take your freedom, it rewrites time. For a long time, no one asked that question, because questions are dangerous inside systems that reward closure more than accuracy. And the longer his case sat sealed in archives and databases, the harder it became for anyone to admit that the foundation itself might be cracked. So life inside became routine in the most unnatural way, a cycle of counts, meals, noise, and waiting, where hope had to be carefully rationed because too much of it could break you faster than despair. He learned the language of survival, when to speak and when silence was safer, how to exist without drawing attention, how to keep the truth alive without letting it consume him. Because innocence doesn't protect you in prison, it isolates you. And being isolated for years reshapes a person in ways no sentence ever mentions. He watched men come and go, some guilty, some broken, some still clinging to versions of themselves that wouldn't survive the walls. And every departure reminded him that time was still moving, just not for him, not in the way it should have. Letters became lifelines, thin threads connecting him to a world that felt increasingly unreal, and each one carried a mix of comfort and cruelty. Because they described lives continuing, children growing, streets changing, while his own existence remained paused in a place where the past was frozen and the future was theoretical. He marked birthdays by memory rather than celebration, anniversaries by absence rather than acknowledgement. And slowly the idea of someday began to feel like a myth people tell themselves to endure impossible stretches of time. Appeals were filed, denied, buried under technical language that made rejection sound procedural rather than personal. As if the system itself was apologizing without ever correcting the harm. Every denial carried the same unspoken message: we are done looking. What hurt more than the confinement was the certainty with which strangers spoke about him. Men and women who had never heard his voice outside of transcripts, who had never seen the way confusion crossed his face when accusations didn't align with reality, who had never felt the weight of a story forced onto them like a borrowed coat that never fit. Somewhere along the way, the narrative hardened. And once a narrative hardens, evidence stops being examined and starts being interpreted to fit. Coincidences became motives. Proximity became intent. Silence became guilt. And the original question, the one that mattered most, faded completely from view. Years later, far from the prison walls, a detail resurfaced, small enough that it had once been dismissed, overlooked because it complicated the story instead of simplifying it. A report that didn't quite match the timeline. A witness statement that conflicted with the official version. At first, it meant nothing, just another anomaly buried among thousands of cases. But anomalies have a way of attracting the right kind of attention when someone is willing to look without needing a conclusion in advance. The person who noticed it wasn't driven by outrage or ideology, just curiosity. The kind that asks quiet questions and refuses easy answers. They didn't know his face, didn't know his history, didn't know the cost of being wrong, and maybe that distance was exactly what allowed them to see clearly. Slowly, pieces began to shift, not dramatically, not publicly, but enough to disturb the surface of a case that had been considered finished for years. Files were reopened reluctantly. Old assumptions were revisited with discomfort. The same evidence that once seemed solid now looked thin when viewed without pressure to confirm an existing belief. Inside his cell, he knew none of this yet. Only that time continued to stretch forward in the same relentless pattern. But something subtle changed in the air around his name, a barely perceptible shift that hadn't existed before. Conversations took on a different tone. Questions were asked twice instead of once. Silence lingered a little longer before answers were given. When he was told that someone was reviewing his case again, he didn't react the way people expect in stories. There was no sudden surge of hope, no emotional release, just caution, because hope had betrayed him too many times to be trusted easily. He had learned that promises meant nothing unless they came with action, and even then, action didn't guarantee justice, only movement. Still, something inside him stirred. A memory of the man he had been before the wrong place and the wrong time collapsed into a permanent sentence. For the first time in years, the truth felt less like a relic and more like a possibility. Distant, fragile, but real. The review process moved slowly, burdened by bureaucracy and resistance. Because correcting a mistake isn't just about freeing one man. It's about confronting every decision that allowed the mistake to stand unchallenged for so long. Each step forward threatened reputations, careers, and the comforting belief that the system works as intended, and those threats created friction at every level. But facts, once allowed space, have a way of asserting themselves. And the more closely the case was examined, the less it resembled the certainty it had once claimed. Timelines unraveled. Conclusions lost their confidence. What had been presented as inevitable now looked rushed, incomplete, and deeply flawed. He was called in for interviews again, years older, quieter, but no less certain of the truth. And this time, the room felt different, not hostile, not sympathetic, but uncertain. And uncertainty was something he hadn't seen in authority for a very long time. He answered the same questions he had answered decades earlier, but now they landed differently. No longer dismissed as inconvenient noise, but weighed. That possibility was dangerous in its own way because once the idea of freedom re-enters your mind, confinement becomes heavier, every locked door louder, every delay more personal, and he had to relearn how to balance hope without letting it consume him because he had seen men break under the weight of expectations that never materialized. The review continued behind layers of procedure and caution, each step slowed by the unspoken fear of what the outcome might reveal. Not just about his case, but about the systems and people that had allowed it to stand unquestioned for so long. Mistakes, after all, are easier to live with when they remain abstract. But this one had a face, a voice, and decades of lost time attached to it. As the scrutiny deepened, uncomfortable truths surfaced, not as dramatic confessions, but as quiet inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored. A timeline that never quite aligned. A witness whose certainty shifted under careful examination. Records that showed signs of selective interpretation rather than objective analysis. None of it alone was explosive, but together it painted a picture of a conclusion reached too early and defended too stubbornly. For those reviewing the case, the realization came gradually. The slow dawning awareness that what had once been presented as certainty was built on convenience and pressure rather than proof. And for the first time, the narrative that had defined his existence began to loosen its grip. Inside the prison, rumors travel faster than official news, and he sensed the change before it was confirmed. A shift in how guards spoke to him, how administrators avoided eye contact, how his name no longer carried the same finality it once had. It wasn't kindness, it was discomfort. The kind that appears when people realize the ground beneath them may not be as solid as they believed. He kept his routine because routine was survival. But internally, he wrestled with questions he had buried for years. Who would he be if this ended, and what would remain of the life that had been taken? Freedom, once imagined as a distant abstraction, now felt frighteningly real. And with it came the realization that justice, even when it arrives, cannot return what was lost. Outside, those reviewing the case faced resistance, subtle but persistent, because admitting a wrongful conviction isn't just about acknowledging error. It's about unraveling a chain of decisions that implicates multiple layers of authority. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Language became cautious, defensive, as if careful phrasing could soften the implications of the truth. But evidence once allowed to breathe has a way of asserting itself, and the more the facts were revisited without the pressure to confirm a predetermined outcome, the clearer it became that his presence at the scene had been coincidence, not intense circumstance, not guilt. The wrong place and the wrong time had been mistaken for a motive, and that mistake had calcified into a lifetime sentence. When the motion was finally filed to challenge the conviction, it didn't come with celebration, just a stark acknowledgement that the case no longer held up under scrutiny. Legal language framed it carefully, but beneath the restraint was an admission that the story told, years earlier, could not be defended without ignoring critical facts. For him, the news arrived in a quiet room, delivered without ceremony, and his reaction surprised even himself. There was no rush of joy, no immediate sense of relief, only a deep, heavy stillness, because, after so long, the idea of being right all along felt less like victory and more like confirmation of a profound injustice. The waiting intensified. Now there was something to lose again, and every day felt sharper, more urgent, because the end was no longer theoretical. He thought about the people who would never see him walk free, about the moments that had passed without him, about the version of himself that had entered the wrong place at the wrong time and never returned. He wondered whether freedom would feel like release or like displacement, because the world he remembered no longer existed, and the one that awaited him had grown unfamiliar in his absence. The truth, once ignored, was now undeniable. But acknowledging it publicly required a decision that carried consequences far beyond his individual case. When the hearing date was set, the gravity of it settled slowly. The realization that decades of silence, denial, and routine were converging on a single moment. He prepared the only way he knew how, by grounding himself in the facts, by reminding himself that the truth had not changed, even when it had been dismissed. Sitting in the courtroom again, older and marked by time, he listened as the case was re-examined, not as a settled matter, but as a question that should have been asked from the beginning. The language was careful, measured. But beneath it was that courage did not arrive all at once. It came hesitantly, wrapped in cautious language and procedural restraint. Because even when the truth becomes impossible to ignore, admitting it requires someone to accept the weight of what was done. And that weight is heavy when measured in decades of a man's life. The courtroom felt different now, not charged with accusation, but with an uneasy awareness that the story everyone had relied on was collapsing under its own contradictions. As the judge listened, the details that had once been dismissed as irrelevant were now central. And the confidence that had once fueled the conviction was notably absent. What replaced it was something far more uncomfortable: doubt. Doubt exposed the fragility of the case in ways no argument ever had. The timeline that once seemed airtight now looked rushed. The interpretations that had once been presented as logical now felt selective. The certainty that had justified the sentence revealed itself as assumption reinforced by authority rather than proof. Each acknowledgement chipped away at the narrative that had defined his existence for so long, and with every fracture, the reality of what had been taken from him became harder to deny. He sat quietly, listening, absorbing, feeling the strange sensation of being seen clearly for the first time in decades. Not as a suspect or a number, but as a person whose life had been redirected by error. When the ruling came, it was delivered without drama. Because justice, when delayed this long, rarely arrives with celebration. The conviction was vacated. The words echoed softly, almost anticlimactic. Yet they carried a weight that reverberated through every year he had spent confined. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. It was simply an admission that the truth he had been telling all along could no longer be denied. The wrong place and the wrong time had never been enough to justify what followed, and the system, however reluctantly, had finally acknowledged that reality. The moment he was told he would be released did not feel like triumph. It felt disorienting, unreal, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. He had imagined this moment so many times that when it finally arrived, it felt strangely empty, because freedom, after being withheld for so long, loses the simplicity it once had. The doors opened, not with symbolic grandeur, but with the same mechanical indifference they always had, and he stepped out carrying nothing but the years he could never give back. The world beyond the walls moved faster than he remembered, louder, unfamiliar, and he realized that release does not erase damage, it only ends the immediate harm. Outside, there were cameras, statements, carefully chosen words meant to acknowledge injustice without fully confronting it. He spoke briefly, because after decades of having his voice ignored, there was nothing left to explain. The truth had never changed, and repeating it now felt unnecessary. What mattered more was the silence that followed, the quiet realization that the life he had lost could not be restored through legal correction alone. Apologies, when they came, sounded insufficient. Not because they weren't sincere, but because no amount of regret could compress time back into what it should have been. He tried to rebuild, slowly, cautiously, learning a world that had advanced without him, where technology replaced habits, and people spoke in references he no longer understood. Relationships had to be reimagined, not resumed, because absence reshapes bonds in irreversible ways. He carried the weight of years spent proving something that should never have been questioned, and even as his name was cleared, the scars of being defined by accusation remained. Innocence, restored on paper, did not immediately translate into peace. It took time to believe that the wrong place and the wrong time no longer defined his future. At night, memories surfaced uninvited, reminders of the life that had been paused while the world moved on. He thought about the version of himself that had walked down that street years ago, unaware of how close he was to losing. Waiting did not end when he walked out, it only changed its shape. Because rebuilding a life after it has been interrupted by injustice is not a single moment of freedom. It is a long series of adjustments, explanations, quiet reckonings that unfold far from courtrooms and headlines. The world's expected resolution. A neat ending where innocence restored automatically translated into peace. But reality was far less accommodating. Every form he filled out, every background check, every hesitant conversation carried echoes of the years he had spent trying to convince strangers of something that should never have been in question. His name, though cleared, still triggered pauses, still required context. And that constant need to explain became its own kind of confinement, a reminder that systems rarely correct themselves fully. They simply move on. He found that time had reshaped him in ways he hadn't noticed while surviving it. Decisions felt heavier. Trust came slower. Simple freedoms carried an unfamiliar weight, because choice, once taken away for long enough, becomes something you have to relearn how to use. He struggled with moments that others took for granted. Crowded spaces, sudden authority, the sound of doors closing too loudly. And at night, sleep came in fragments, interrupted by memories that refused to stay in the past. People around him wanted to celebrate his release, to frame it as a victory. But he knew better than anyone that justice delayed is not justice restored. It is a partial correction layered over irreversible loss. The years he had lost showed themselves in subtle, painful ways. Careers that might have been built never existed. Relationships that could have deepened were reduced to what-ifs. Family members had grown older without him. Some had passed away before they could see the truth acknowledged, and that absence carried a grief that no legal ruling could address. He learned to grieve not just people, but possibilities, the alternate life that would always remain just out of reach. And yet, despite everything, he refused to let bitterness define him, not because the system deserved forgiveness, but because survival had taught him that holding on to anger indefinitely only hands more time to those who had already taken too much. As his story spread, journalists, advocates, and officials reached out, each wanting a piece of it. An explanation, a lesson, a quote that could fit neatly into an article or report. He spoke when it felt necessary, not to relive the pain, but to make something useful out of it, because silence had cost him enough. He emphasized how ordinary his life had been, how easily it had been dismantled by assumptions, and how dangerous certainty becomes when it replaces careful inquiry. He reminded them that his case wasn't unique, it was just visible, and visibility, he had learned, often determined who received justice and who remained buried beneath procedure. Behind the scenes, there were internal reviews, policy discussions, carefully worded acknowledgments that framed his ordeal as an unfortunate anomaly rather than a predictable outcome of flawed processes. He recognized the language immediately because he had lived inside its consequences for decades. Institutions prefer lessons that don't require accountability, reforms that sound meaningful without challenging the culture that allowed the error in the first place. Still, small changes began to surface: additional oversight, revised protocols, training meant to emphasize caution over speed, and while none of it could return his years, he took some comfort in knowing that his story might interrupt the cycle for someone else standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Personally, the path forward remained uncertain, but uncertainty felt different now, less threatening than it once had, because at least it belonged to him again. He found moments of quiet satisfaction in ordinary things: walking without supervision, making plans without permission, waking up without a schedule dictated by someone else. These moments did not erase the past, but they grounded him in the present, reminding him that despite everything, he was still here, still capable of shaping what remained. Healing, he learned, was not about forgetting. It was about integrating the past without allowing it to consume the future. There were days when the weight of it all returned unexpectedly, triggered by a news headline, a familiar phrase, a reminder of how easily narratives form and how rarely they are questioned once they gain momentum. On those days, he returned to the same truth that had sustained him through years of confinement. Reality exists independent of belief, and truth does not require validation to remain true. That belief had kept him intact when everything else had been stripped away, and it continued to guide him as he navigated a world that still struggled to ownership changed everything. Because for the first time in decades, his life was no longer being interpreted, summarized, or decided by someone else. It was simply being lived, imperfectly and cautiously, but honestly. He learned that freedom is not loud. It does not announce itself with certainty or comfort. It reveals itself in small, fragile moments that accumulate slowly. Moments where no one is watching, judging, or recording. Choosing what to eat, where to go, when to leave a room. These decisions carried a quiet significance that outsiders rarely notice. But for him, they were proof that his existence no longer required permission. And yet, even in those moments, the past lingered, not as a chain, but as a shadow that reminded him how easily all of it could be taken away again if vigilance ever faded. He became more observant of the world around him, noticing how quickly assumptions form, how easily authority fills in gaps with conclusions rather than questions. He saw versions of himself in strangers, in people moving through their lives unaware of how thin the line is between ordinary and irreversible, how one misinterpreted moment can spiral into something permanent. That awareness was heavy, but it was also grounding, because it made him careful with judgment, patient with uncertainty, and deeply aware of how fragile truth becomes when power is convinced it already has the answer. He spoke less, listened more, and when he did speak, it was with intention, choosing words that reflected not anger, but clarity. Over time, his story settled into the public record, cited as a failure corrected, a lesson learned, but he understood better than anyone that correction does not equal closure. Closure is a luxury reserved for stories with clean endings, and his did not have one. There would always be gaps where years should have been, faces missing from photographs, conversations that never happened. But instead of being consumed by those absences, he learned to carry them with honesty, acknowledging what was lost without allowing it to define everything that remained. Acceptance did not mean approval. It meant refusing to let injustice claim any more of his future than it already had. There were moments of anger, of course, moments when the enormity of it all pressed in and demanded to be felt. But those moments passed more quickly now, softened by the understanding that his survival itself was an act of defiance. He had endured a system that mistook coincidence for guilt and certainty for truth. And he had emerged intact enough to speak about it, to warn others, to insist that mistakes have faces and consequences, not just footnotes. His existence became evidence that innocence can persist even when it is ignored, and that resilience is not loud heroism, but the quiet refusal to disappear. As years went on, the phrase that once haunted him began to lose its power. It's the wrong place, the wrong time. What had once felt like a sentence began to feel like a warning, a reminder of how easily lives can be redirected when systems prioritize speed over understanding. He did not romanticize what happened to him, nor did he frame it as destiny. It was a failure, plain and simple, and naming it as such was part of reclaiming control. By refusing to soften the truth, he honored not just his own experience, but the experiences of countless others whose stories never reached the light. In quieter moments, he allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by repair, but by presence, a life lived deliberately rather than defensively. He understood now that while a lifetime had been taken, the remaining time still carried meaning, and meaning, unlike years, cannot be stolen unless it is surrendered. He chose not to surrender it. He chose to live with awareness, to question certainty, to value truth even when it is inconvenient, because those values had sustained him when nothing else could. The story